Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. It's Monday, July 10th, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. Now, we've got a great show for you today, but before we launch in, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Remember, you can support the show in a bunch of ways, one of which is by visiting patreon.com/talknerdy and pledging your support on an episodic basis, like Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Charles Payette, Jonathan Wright, Christian Jeffrey, Jeffrey Perez, Stuart Ogue, The Honorable Husband, Jafe, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell have all done. And of course, hundreds more of you, like Dave Crane and Eugenio Belinsky, and also Leslie Longhurst and Gail Stanfill have also done. I want to thank you all so much for your unwavering support. It's because of you that Talk Nerdy is possible. Now, remember, there's other ways to support the show. Mostly, I think a really effective way is to rate and review on iTunes, on Google Play, on Stitcher, on any of the places where you download your podcast. And also share through social media, share with your friends and colleagues and family. And of course, don't forget to visit my website, carasantamaria.com, where you can see the Talk Nerdy store. I've got lots of cool swag for you guys to be able to purchase. All of that, all of those sales go 100% to support the show. All right. I'm excited about this week's episode. I had a chance to chat with a really great journalist. He's New York based and he's written for all sorts of places: Condé Nast Traveler, GQ, Discover Magazine, Mother Jones, Scientific American, Business Week, Newsweek. But what's really exciting is his recent book. It's called The Bodybuilders: Inside the Science of the Engineered Human. So in just a moment, I sit down with Adam Piore and we talk about some incredible improvements, changes. I don't know what the right word to use would be, but just things that are happening in the field of bioengineering. So, gosh, I don't want to make you wait anymore. So, guys, without any further ado, here he is, Adam Piore. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, great to be here.
I am so excited after some kind of a comedy of errors of trying to get together on this show. We're finally able to make it work. We almost got to do it in person when I was in New York and Connecticut recently, but my filming schedule got all screwed up. And then we randomly ran into each other on the train.
Yeah, that was amazing. I recognized you from your website photo.
So weird that happened.
Sitting
It
there with
blew
your
my
luggage.
mind.
Yeah.
I know. How did we end up on the same car, leaving New York at the same time, headed to Connecticut? That's just really bizarre.
Right.
And then, of course, I had some Wi-Fi, or actually power issues here in LA, as is kind of par for the course. But now we're finally together, and we're going to be talking about your new book, The Bodybuilders: Inside the Science of the Engineered Human. I love bioengineering. It's such a fun topic. It has, I don't know, it has everything that you love in a good story, right? Because you get to talk about people and their journeys, which is always, I think, how we connect the best to science communication. There's some kind of scary stuff in it. There's some beautiful stuff in it. There's the kind of stuff that makes you cry. And ultimately, it makes us really think hard about the future of humanity as a whole. So before we get into the actual book, I want to talk a little bit about what got you to the place where you decided to write this book. You are a journalist, right? What is your typical beat when you are writing for outlets?
Well, I've covered a lot of things in my career. I mean, I covered Congress in the 90s for a paper in Jersey. I left in the middle of Monica Lewinsky, and I traveled abroad. I lived in Cambodia, wrote from there, covered the aftermath of genocide, and interviewed former Khmer Rouge people. And then I went to work at Newsweek International, where I was an editor, but I also covered 9/11 from ground zero and went to Iraq. And then I was an editor at Reader's Digest, just spinning out stories. And I really like to do long narratives, but I also, one theme that's been common in my career is just the idea of human resilience. I majored in psychology in college. And I don't know, I've just been always been fascinated about how people kind of bounce back from adversity, how one event can change you, and sort of how people manage that. And I started doing science writing about 10 years ago, just because, it's just, first of all, I found it fascinating. I have done science writing intermittently throughout my career, but I started to realize that there was sort of a really fascinating revolution going on, basically, and that some of the most exciting stories of human resilience were being unleashed by this field that is bioengineering. At the time, I didn't really realize that was sort of the rabbit hole I was going down. I just wanted to tell a good story, and I had heard about, I was going to do some stories for Discover magazine, with long narrative stories. And I'd heard about this guy named Hugh Herr, who some people might have heard of. He was this, he was like a C&D student in high school, and he was becoming a famous rock climber, a prodigy. He had climbed all these cliffs that nobody else could climb, and he had gotten a reputation, was in all these climbing magazines. He was 17, and he wandered into the wilderness with his friend, and they got lost in after ice climbing, and they almost died, and they were rescued on the verge of death, and he had frostbite, and both his limbs were amputated below the knee. And so the doctors told him he'd never climb or run again. But he started tinkering with his prosthetics, and he made them he said, screw that, I'm climbing. And he went on the wall, and he made his prosthetics like 7 feet long so he could reach these holds. He made little bladed things so that he could stick them in crevices. And he became an even better climber than before. But the prosthetics that he was wearing were like, peg legs. And so he began sort of studying how to make them more comfortable because they were so uncomfortable. And he sort of discovered engineering, became a straight A student. And today he's one of the leading prosthetics engineers in the country at MIT. And he's basically reverse engineered the leg. And it's such an incredible story to tell, just sort of this epic adventure he had. But I also was just fascinated at the technology of what he did. And what he did is, it's actually at this point, technology has advanced to the point where, in the human body, there's somewhere around 200 bones, 350 joints, 700 muscles, 4,000 tendons. And we finally have the sensing power to sort of see how these constituent parts interact. So what he did is he sort of figured out how all the constituent parts of the leg interact. And it turns out that the leg is basically like a web of complicated springs that basically absorb energy, juggle them, and then recycle them. Every time we take a step, we're recycling about 50% of our energy. And he figured out how these springs and the constituent parts of this elaborate web of springs fit together. He put it into a mathematical model. He put it on a computer chip, and then he built a robot that could emulate what the leg does. And when I went to visit him and I walked across the quad with him at MIT, I was slipping on ice, and I couldn't even tell that he didn't have any legs, that he was walking on robotic legs. So that to me was the beginning of this journey, just because, well, one, it was sort of science fiction, the bionic man. And two, I just began to realize, and I began to write these stories about people using these technologies, the computational power, the sensing power, the engineering power, to reverse engineer the human body and mind. And that's what sort of all the things in my book have in common. I'm trying to tell these great stories. There's all these eureka moments, but also there's so much at stake. Hugh Herr used to wake up in the morning having dreamt that he was, running through the cornfields behind his parents' house. And then he would see that his legs were gone, and he would realize he would never run again. And now he jogs around Walton Pond every day. What could be better than that? And so many different realms we're doing that. We don't have the computational power yet to understand how the billions of neurons in our brains, the patterns, to decode them and understand the speech that we imagine. But that was an area that I looked at also, because scientists have discovered that when we decide to talk, we send not just signals to our motor cortex to tell us how to make the sounds, but we send a signal to the auditory cortex as an error correction mechanism. And we now have the sensing power to detect that stream of signal. But, it's too many neurons involved to figure out and decode it on a real-time basis. But that will change as we get more resolution. So that was a very long answer to your
No, but
question.
it's true that the kind of latter part of the answer that we are getting there and we're starting to see it with certain types of sensory systems, maybe a little bit more like the motor system. Well, that's not a sensory system, but
Right.
we're starting to see more sensory motor interplay, right? New and better robots and prosthetics that have sensory feedback, pressure
Right.
sensors, temperature
Yeah.
sensors, things of that nature. And we're getting there. And definitely, as I think you talked about in the book as well, this sort of quote unquote telepathic sense, which really is just utilizing the motor system and connecting it to outward prostheses. But before we dive into all of the beautiful stories in the book, I would love to ask so Hugh Herr, who I guess based on your answer was sort of the impetus or at least the starting point here. Were you doing a separate project about him? Or were you just so incredibly interested that you decided, I'm going to go interview this person, do some reporting, learn as much as I can, and then sort of the book came from that?
Well, actually, so what happened is, it was 2008, and I had, like I said, I'd done science writing intermittently throughout my career, but at the time, my industry was in complete disarray. I was working at Reader's Digest as a features editor, and I was laid off, and because they were bankrupt, and the financial crisis was going on, and Newsweek, which had been where I worked before, was sold for $1. And so the only so to be honest, so I started doing all these things when I went back to freelancing. And one of the things I was doing was I was helping Columbia University wanted to put up a tech ventures website for all their technologies, the intellectual stuff that they're that just as it happened, because I went to Columbia Journalism School many years ago, I was helping them and I was interviewing all these people who had come up with these incredible technologies for Columbia Medical School. And I was learning about the ways that they were applying technologies. But then I also had a former editor that I had worked with at Newsweek who was an editor at Discover Magazine. And he invited me to give him some pitches and I wanted to do some good stories. So I was just looking around and I had heard about Hugh Herr. I had read about him. He's a little bit famous. He's given a TED Talk. And at the time he was talking about being his own test subject and, trying to connect these robotic prostheses directly to his nervous system so he could control them just by thinking. So I thought that was pretty wild. And so, Discover commissioned me to do this story. So I went up to Boston and started and talked to Hugh. And it turned into, I think maybe a 4,000 word story or something. And through that, there were so many different technologies that he was involved with. And even today, he has opened or is in the process of opening something called the Center for Extreme Bionics with a guy named Ed Boyden at MIT, who's one of the discoverers of optogenetics at Stanford, which is sort of revolutionizing our ability to turn on and off individual neurons. And this guy named I think it was Robert Lance, one of the pioneers of regenerative medicine. So he was sort of the gateway guy to this whole world of this kind of stuff. And then I enjoyed writing it so much that I started, initially it was resilience and also this great story, but I also was like, wow, there's all this science fiction stuff going on. Like I didn't know that we could make a bionic man. And then, so the next one was like, wow, we can do that. People are trying to regrow a limb. Is that even possible? And then it was, so I just started writing these kinds of stories for a little while until I realized there was this unifying principle. And then I just wanted to write a book because it really is sort of this frontier, one of the most exciting areas of human resilience. If you want to write about that, the most exciting stories are sort of being unleashed in this area, in the United States, at least,
And the cool thing is it's still happening. Like we're really only at the beginning of what's possible within the field of bioengineering. And of course, it's also happening on multiple levels. We have kind of legitimate, I guess I can put it that way, legitimate research happening in the kind of hallowed halls of these erudite research institutions. And then we have a sort of like DIY undercurrent of, this quote unquote body hacking, where individuals across the world are maybe not trying to correct damage or dysfunction, but instead are interested in improving certain capabilities, some of which I think really really fundamentally are pseudoscience, and some of which
Right.
actually are kind of an interesting direction to go. Have you had a chance to dig into that kind of weird world?
Yeah, I did a little bit. I talked to and I just when it came and I talked to people like the first human cyborg and different people. There's a famous guy in over in the University of Reading, and I think what did he do?
He's not the guy with the ear on his arm, is he?
No, I don't think so. But that might be one of his graduate students.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
He had somehow what did he insert? I don't know. He called himself the first human cyborg, and he had inserted things into his own body like computer chips and different things. And I talked to people who were inserting magnets into their hands. That's
a pretty common one, right? Like that's kind of a low risk. Oh, I'll put a magnet in the tip of my finger, and then I can have magnet sense, which is like not sure about that, but
right.
Okay.
And people putting RFD tags, and I did plumb that, and there is this subculture, and I was even going to go out to Pittsburgh and try and hang with these people who are called from something called Grindhouse, because I had met them at some transhumanist conference, but then I just decided, you know what, I don't really need to get into that. Like, I there's enough sort of concrete stuff here that's telling us what I was interested in is I wanted my book to apply to a broad range of people, including those people, but, to appeal to them. But I figured it's sort of, we're pushing the limit. We're understanding how the human body and mind work down to the molecular level. In some cases, we're beginning to learn that. And a lot of the technologies I reviewed are telling us where our limits lie and how we might overcome them. So somebody who's in the DIY community might want to read my book to see, what's known about how these things work and be able to better evaluate what's actually possible. But I ended up cutting out anything that could be construed as wacky, I guess. Although some of it sounds so far out there that it sounds wacky, but it had to really blow my mind to make it in there.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good approach too, because it sort of pushes past the headlines. The DIY side seems to be what is sort of the clickbait side when we see these articles circulating. And the truth of the matter is a lot of that really undercuts the incredible technology that is happening at the university level or in these research laboratories. Just simply, I think, as a matter of funding, as a matter of limitations, technology limitations in the tools that they use, and kind of IRB approval, all of that good stuff. There's only so much that you can do in your garage, at least right now. I think we'll move to a place where this becomes much more democratized, but that always happens with technology as it gets cheaper. But we're still in the R&D side of a lot of these things that you're talking about. And, a story about magnets and fingers in a lot of ways is kind of smoke and mirrors. And I think it really doesn't get to the core of what is possible. I mean, some of the stories that you feature in this book are crazy. What would you say is the most outlandish, like when you first heard about it and you first started digging into your reporting, you were like, this is sci-fi, this can't be real?
Well, I guess it would be the effort to try and decode imagined thoughts. I mean, and actually that's sort of relevant, because what I was thinking about when you're talking about these people who are DIY is one thing that I encountered that surprised me was that there are all these people who, they were sort of science geeks when they were growing up. They read science fiction, and maybe they would have, when they were like 15 or something, stuck a magnet in their hand or something. But they actually structured their academic careers on bringing some of these sci-fi ideas that they had read about to fruition, right? So, and one of those guys was in the chapter I did on what they called synthetic telepathy, the effort to decode imagined speech. And, in my book, because I decided I started out just looking at straight up human augmentation, but the stories that really blew my mind were stories of resilience, where people really lost something in their life and were regaining it. So for the chapter on imagined speech, I decided to profile a guy who is working on it now, but also a guy who was locked in, who lost the ability to talk because he had ALS, and he he was going to be fully locked in, but he was young, so he was slowly losing the ability to communicate with the people around him. And he offered to undergo an experimental procedure to insert electrodes into his motor cortex so he could, artificially speak. But the guy who first funded this was an army guy named Elmer Schmeisser. And Elmer Schmeisser had grown up reading science fiction, and he had read, I think it was an Arthur C. Clarke book about something called a thought helmet. And in the book, somebody had a helmet they could put on, and it allowed them to communicate telepathically with other people. So when he got in a position to fund research at the age of like 55 or something, and he's like this colonel who is also studies like jiu-jitsu and, is just this weird sort of Renaissance guy, he was like, I want to fund somebody to make a thought helmet. So he funded this guy named Gerwin Schalk. And Gerwin, wasn't even sure if it was possible to decode imagined speech and make a thought helmet that would allow soldiers to communicate telepathically. But that was this old science geek's idea. He wanted soldiers to be like in the caves of Tora Bora going after Osama bin Laden, able to be like, okay, he's on the left, but just be like, thinking of it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so he funded Gerwin, and Gerwin has been going, so that really blew my mind that we could actually decode your thoughts when you're talking and send it telepathically, wirelessly to somebody else's earphone, and that they could decode it. But sure enough, Gerwin then took me. Well, first of all, I went into a hospital room with him where there was an epilepsy patient who had the top of her skull lifted off, and they put electrodes directly onto her cortex so they could find seizures, but they're just waiting for her to have a seizure. So she's sitting in the hospital bed, looking at a screen where sentences are flashing on the screen, and she's imagining saying them, and Gerwin is collecting all this data. But after we did that, we went across the way, and he played me, collaborating with these researchers at Berkeley. They had played music for epilepsy patients with the similar rigs with these electrodes on their naked cortex, and they had recorded the signals in their auditory cortex as they listened to the music. And then they had run the signals recorded from the auditory cortex back through a computer and decoded them. And he played me what the decoded sound sounded like. And I recognized a song from Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall, like decoded from these people's neurons. It was like really crazy.
What?
Yeah. I'll send you a link.
Insane.
Yeah.
That's so crazy.
It sounded like it was underwater, but it was like the bass and the guitar solo, and it was like because what they found, and it's the same thing with the motor cortex, and I think this is very cool. But I tried to, I actually did a story on an experiment where they were trying to give dogs in Washington rapamycin to try and see if they could live longer. And the way you feed a dog a pill they don't want to eat is you put it in peanut butter. So all this science is like, the story is the peanut butter, but the science is like the pill. That's the way I write. You know what I mean? So, to give you more of the pill, though, what they found is that neurons, and they found this when they decoded the way vision is translated in the brain, they have what's called a tuning curve, right? So certain neurons respond more robustly to certain sounds or certain, colors, or depending on what part of the brain they're in. So in your auditory cortex, certain neurons are attuned when a certain sound comes in at a certain frequency. Different populations of neurons will fire more robustly when they hear the things that they're attuned to. So they had decoded the tuning curves of certain populations of neurons, and then they could just run that back and play the music.
That's great. And so you really do get something as an output that's actually perceptible. It's not just muddied and kind of darts at a dartboard, but it really is clean enough that you personally could identify it, which is like mind blowing.
Right.
It really is.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is that these are a little bit gimmicky, just in that you have to train the algorithm. Like, you have to expose your computer program to the same. It's not going to be able to. You can't just put these electrodes on somebody's brain without training the computer program, and it won't be able to translate it yet. We don't have that level of specificity. It has to know where to look, and it has to know how your particular brain, the weights of different neurons, how your brain has been trained to recognize it. It's a pattern recognition program, but it will get more refined as we, as the technology advances.
And as individual users, I guess, continue to add their data to that sort of large set. I know that I was reading a bit about these prosthetic studies where it's sort of along the same lines, but mostly just focusing on the motor cortex, not for speech, but for movement of like a robotic arm, for example, which of course we've been doing in primates for quite a while.
Yeah.
Which is, a little bit easier to, I don't know if I want to say easier, but
on
the ethical scale, it's a little easier, I guess. And it's, the training protocols are probably a bit easier for a primate. Whereas for individuals, they have to have really experienced a big loss, and it's incredibly draining, isn't it, for them to have to go in the lab for hours and hours and hours and train on these things. Even individuals who are, I recently did a TV show called Brain Surgery Live for National Geographic. I was a co-host on it. And it was a very low-risk brain surgery, obviously. Like the first time you're going to televise brain surgery in the U.S., you're not going to pick something where the patient could die on the table. It was an awake brain surgery for an individual with Parkinson's disease where they were, stimulating the brain with these embedded electrodes. They had to find where they should go to try to calm the tremors. And even individuals who have these sort of packs that are sort of installed into their brain where they can then turn up or turn down the stimulus after the fact once their head is closed back up, they even tell me that it doesn't work right away. You have to do it a lot and train it and figure out exactly what the amperage is and exactly what the voltage is. And it sometimes it's a solid year of training before you get maximum results. And that always really seems to be the case, because even though all of our brains follow a similar structural organization, of course, there are massive individual differences. And then on top of that, you layer something like dysfunction or disease, which has its own individual differences. It's very specific. And of course, incredibly complicated.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I have a chapter in my book on neuroplasticity, which is exactly what you're talking about, which is, they found out that neurons that they're saying, I'm sure you've heard it, neurons that fire together, wire together, right? So the connections form based on how often neurons fire in tandem, and so if, so experience can change the wiring in the brain. But I was going to say that just parenthetically, where Gerwin Schalk works, one of his at the Wadsworth Institute in Albany, New York, they also have done experiments with the motor cortex, and I think the motor cortex is simpler than decoding speech because the signals are more they're easier to decode. They're not as complex.
They're spread out a little more, right? Like the motor cortex really does have sort of, to some extent, I don't want to oversimplify, but like a homunculus aspect to it. There's this strip of motor cortex, and this strip of sensory cortex, and they really do sort of follow point-to-point correlation between, this is where your fingertips move, and this is where your lips move, and this is where. But then speech, of course, which is still motor, it's in the motor area and the frontal area, is way more complicated.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, and they're trying to decode not speech. They're trying to decode it in the auditory cortex, which is what the speech would sound like.
Yeah.
Because apparently that signal still goes to your auditory cortex if you imagine speaking it, whereas if you imagine speaking it, it doesn't go to your motor cortex. Because you're not trying. But I talked to one of the guys at Wadsworth, and I asked him about the whether you could take even these motor cortex driven prosthetics out of the lab, and he said, not yet. He's like, you wouldn't want to drive them, control a wheelchair and drive it in traffic or on the edge of a cliff right now. And until you can do that, and until you can do that, you're not going to want to take it out of the lab. And it's because of neuroplasticity, because I mean, it's too hard to explain here, but the different ways that our neurons fire, the populations of neurons that can cause a certain movement will change with time and based on experience. But the other thing I wanted to say is along those lines of neuroplasticity, in my chapter, I looked at the same thing that you were saying about the Parkinson's deep brain stimulation. They found that with the cochlear implant, and that the amazing thing that they have discovered about the brain is that it's a really robust pattern recognition machine, and it can be trained, and these connections can change. And so when they first did the cochlear implant, it didn't work. People told, and I interviewed one of the pioneers in this, they told him that the device he had made, which shocked the cochlea in the ear, to try and mimic, what happens when your hearing actually works. They said it was just garbage. They couldn't recognize the sounds that were coming into their brain. But over time, a few months later, since the patterns that their cochlea was being shocked with were consistent and they related to specific sounds, their brain reorganized itself and learned to recognize these. And all of a sudden, they understood speech.
Wow.
So and so this woman that I profiled in my book, in that chapter, which is my second favorite next to Hugh Herr, this woman named Pat Fletcher, she was blinded. She lost her eyeballs in a grenade factory explosion. And she got this.
No, she did not. A grenade factory explosion.
Right. Yeah, it sounds pretty bad.
I know. Wow.
I mean, it's an interesting story to tell. I mean, she was describing to me how she was holding this hose and it got really hot. And she was like, I wonder what that's about. And then the hose was leading into this barrel, and the barrel started to bulge out, and she's like, I wonder what that is. And then there was like an explosion, But she loved nature and always hiked. And one of the things that was devastating about losing her sight is, she couldn't do that anymore. But years later, she found this, what they call a sensory substitution device, and it was invented. And I just chose this because it shows the, the power that our brain has to adapt and rewire itself. This device, it took you had a camera, and this was invented by a Dutch engineer. It took the pixels that would come into the camera and it converted them into a consistent pattern of tones. So our brain is capable of discerning like 40 different tones at the same time, right? So each pixel, so the higher up in the picture the pixel was, the higher up the tone. And the brighter it was, the louder the tone. So it would convert, they call it a reverse spectrograph. It would convert these pictures into what are called soundscapes with this pastiche of tones. And Pat Fletcher, this woman, she started experimenting with this thing. And she, at first she thought it was ridiculous, but then there was one that was like a gate, and she felt like she could see the gate. And the world of a blind person has been described as very claustrophobic. You can only see in your mind's eye what's in front of you based on touch,
Yeah.
Although when it rains, people have described there being depth because you can hear things out there.
Kind of almost like echolocation. Yeah, you can hear these things bouncing back.
So Pat had that experience when she heard this soundscape. Suddenly her world expanded. And she was blown away. So she, I think she found this program because she wanted a program that would that she could point a camera at her clothes and it would tell her what color they were, and then she could match them. But this program she found had this other component that this engineer had created. So she went out and she bought a little camera and put it on a hat, and she went around with headphones, and she started wearing it all the time. And she could see patterns on her dentist's wall and the steam rising off of coffee cups. But over time, the complexity that she could perceive got more and more sophisticated until she regained depth perception. She could actually look into a sink. And she didn't use her cane anymore. She didn't need a seeing eye dog. And then she actually, one day she was at a conference on sensory substitution with the guy who invented it. And they were standing in the desert, and she was telling him what her experience was. And she said, "What are those things out there?" And he said, "They're mountains." And she started crying because she hadn't seen mountains in so long. And, but they took her to Harvard Medical School, and they scanned her brain, and they found out that her brain had learned to actually reroute these soundscapes to her visual cortex. So in a sense, she really was seeing again, but it was just the consistency. People have said we see with the brain, not with the eyes. It was the consistency of these signals coming in that had trained her brain to make sense of this. So I don't know. I just went
incredible.
Down. Yeah, I went down another rabbit hole there.
No, I love the rabbit holes. That's what my show's all about. The rabbit holes are the most interesting part. Yeah, I feel like I've heard something sort of similar, although I bet it would be restricted in terms of sort of breadth. But I've heard something similar about this kind of postage stamp prosthesis that you put on your tongue.
Right, yeah, the tongue camera, yeah.
Yeah,
it's
that
very
sort of
similar.
tries to have a visual, but it seems like you would have way less sort of resolution on just the number of neurons that you have, or I should say taste receptors, or, different kinds of receptors that you have in your tongue versus your entire auditory system.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, at this, like, people talk about the tongue camera and this, and I know they do the tongue camera because you have so many different taste receptors on there.
Yeah.
But I couldn't find a case as remarkable as this. I actually did talk to a guy who used the tongue camera, but he was kind of using it as a gimmick. He's this blind climber who also recently wrote a book and has sort of inspirational stuff. I forget what his name is, but Eric something.
Google Eric with tongue camera.
Yeah.
I could try to look it up for you if you want. Let's see. Eric.
He's a mountain climber. He climbed Everest blind. He's like the blind mountain climber.
Wow, Jesus Christ. He climbed Mount Everest. Okay, the blind climber who sees with his tongue. Discover magazine. Wouldn't it be funny if you wrote this article? Eric Weihenmayer.
Right. Yeah, right.
Weihenmayer.
I talked to him, and he was telling me somebody rolled a ball across the table and he could actually see it and stop the ball with his hand. But it wasn't the same level of, I don't think the thing about Pat Fletcher, and I don't know if it was the resolution with which this camera thing, is that she wore it every day. And if you wear it every day, it's, your brain forges these new connections.
Yeah, and she could wear it every day, right? Because she wouldn't have to take it out to eat, like somebody which would be difficult. And just like it seems like with almost all of these incredible stories of neuroprostheses, of just bioengineering as a whole, it really has a steep learning curve. Like the more you do it, the more your brain can reorganize. Even when it comes to things like prostheses in your legs, which you think, well, that's not neural. That's completely just help, Right. No, of course that reorganizes your brain. The sensation that you're walking when you weren't doing that before. Individuals who live half their lives in wheelchairs have kind of new sensory development in areas where their chairs feel like they are sort of connected to their bodies and they are a continuation of their motor capabilities. Everything we do in essence has a feedback loop and helps us improve the specificity in our brain. So the more that we do these kinds of things, of course, the better we're going to get at it.
Right. I also have a chapter that relates to that, and it's on intuition, because intuition is also, actually exists, even though that sounds like one of those flaky things, but it's based on this phenomenon of neuroplasticity, which is that, the more we're exposed to something, the stronger, the stronger that memory is sort of manifested in the physical connections, a strength of connections between individual neurons in our brain. And in the chapter, I was writing about, I came across this while I was reporting this book, and this actually did blow my mind too, which is that the military has a project where they're trying to reverse engineer intuition, because what happened is they started hearing all these stories from people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who, they would be like, yeah, there's this one guy in my unit and he just seems to know when something bad is going to happen. Everyone always wants him with them. And there were people who would be out like on a convoy and they would halt the convoy and they'd say something's wrong and they wouldn't be able to say what it was. And then everybody would go out and they would find an IED. And so the military is like, well, what is this about? Is this real? And it turns out that there is actually this interesting body of literature out there about this phenomenon, and they're trying to find ways and use current technology to train it so that you could take somebody from, the foothills of Colorado who's never been to Iraq and train them beforehand so that when you drop them in there, they can immediately sense when there's an IED.
Oh, interesting. So these people that are kind of hyper perceptive outside of this environment, maybe we could train them to be better kind of
So what they
more
found,
intuitive soldiers.
Yeah, what they found is that there's a form of learning called implicit learning, that we're not, it's learning that occurs outside of our awareness. And, we all know that if you ride a bicycle, that's motor memory. And you can also be driving home and you don't even remember driving home, but you've driven home and you're like, how'd I get here? Well, it turns out that they've discovered that you can also have that kind of implicit learning using the same structures of the brain for perceptual expertise. So what happens is, and the famous case is, and I think this was related in some other books, like in Malcolm Gladwell's Blink and some other things. But there's a researcher that I talked to named Gary Klein, and what he did is he wanted to understand how this type of thing. He just wanted to know how people made decisions who were experts. So he studied firefighters, and he went and interviewed them. And it turned out most of them who were experienced operated by instinct. He thought that they would consider all their options in a crisis situation and decide, but they just knew what to do. And there's this famous case of this one firefighter he was in a house fire in Cleveland, and they were trying to put out this fire in the kitchen, and suddenly he got a feeling, and he said to his men, "We got to get out of here." And they ran out, and right when they ran out, the floor underneath where they had been standing collapsed into the basement. And there had been a fire raging in the basement. And for years, this guy was convinced he had ESP.
Yeah.
But when he talked to Klein, it turned out that he had picked up on these subtle cues that arose from his expertise. He had picked up on this pattern mismatch, which was that there wasn't enough smoke where they were to account, or flames to account for the heat around them. There was a fire raging in the basement. And so he couldn't explain what was wrong, but he had enough experience that he knew something was wrong, and he got his men out. So
fascinating. I feel like that I feel a parallel, or I see a parallel kind of in my mind between these individuals who have, what's known as cortical blindness, where they damage a part of their cortex, but their entire visual system is intact otherwise. So they're really just missing the very end of the visual cue that they're getting, that processing that happens right before it becomes conscious awareness. And people with cortical blindness cannot see. Like, they are essentially blind. They have no light perception, but they'll do things like step over curbs and walk around fire hydrants, or catch a ball if you throw it at them. And you ask them, "Why'd you do that?" And they're like, "I don't know. I just had like a gut feeling." Or they'll say, I don't know I did anything. Like, what are you talking about?
Right. So they've studied this with amnesiacs. So one of the earliest examples is not cortical blindness, but this idea that we have two separate streams that we learn through them. The explicit learning, which is what we're consciously aware of, and which might be stored by our hippocampus, and we have an episodic memory of it. And implicit learning, the things that we don't know that we know. So back in I don't know when, the turn of the century, this French doctor, he met this patient. There was an amnesiac patient in his clinic, and he would meet her every day and shake her hand, and she never remembered meeting him. Every day was as if she was meeting him for the first time. So he put a pin in between two fingers in his hand, and he shook her hand one day, and she recoiled. The next day she didn't remember meeting him again, but she wouldn't shake his hand.
Yeah.
So he was like, what is going on here? But she knew somehow. And it turns out, with brain scanning technology and stuff, we have learned that there are different streams of information processing. And so motor memory, when we learn to bounce a basketball or ride a bike or catch a ball when someone throws it at us, even though we don't have a conscious, we don't consciously register that we see it. All of that is coming in through the stream that's sort of bypassing the prefrontal cortex, the areas of our brain. And if it does break into our awareness, in the case of these instincts, it has to, if there's a lot going on, if you're in the middle of a battle, you might be distracted, and it'll be hard for something that you're picking up on the edge of awareness to break in. So, but going back to neuroplasticity, the thing that they've discovered is that, like I said, neurons that fire together wire together. And so there's a statistical element to these sort of gut feelings that we get. So the way that you take somebody from the foothills of Colorado and you train them to recognize that there might be something wrong or an IED subconsciously to get one of those feelings is you have to expose them with a lot of drill training. That's what they're learning. They're doing this research at Northwestern University. There's a guy named Paul Reber, and he's been doing experiments like this. And Daniel Kahneman, who's this Nobel Prize winning economist, he often writes about how intuition can lead us wrong, lead us astray. We have these implicit biases and feelings that we pay attention to that are based on, incorrect assumptions. And so it has to do with, the way that circuits are activated in our brain in different groups of neurons based on how often they fire together, right? So if every time I saw a red car, my wife got out of it, then the next time I see a red car, I'm going to look at the red car and I'm going to expect my wife to get out of it. I'm going to have a feeling that my wife is going to get out of it. But that's not a representative of reality. It's because I've just seen a small sample of red cars. So you have to make sure that you're exposed, the number of red cars I'm exposed to and the people getting out of it is representative of what I'm likely to see in the real world. I don't know if that.
And then you have to. No, it makes perfect sense. And then you have to push past, all of these other cognitive biases and this baggage that comes along with it, like confirmation bias, where sure, maybe the first 3 or 4 times you see a red car, or let's pick a weird color, I don't know, a fuchsia car. That's rare. Let's say your wife has a fuchsia car. So of course, every time you see a fuchsia car, your wife is stepping out of your fuchsia car. The first 4 times in your life you ever saw one, that was the case. And then later, of course, you come across more fuchsia cars, but you tend to remember the hits and not the misses. So you sort of explain away every time you get a negative result. Right. Oh, it wasn't my wife, but that wasn't quite fuchsia. Like, I don't know, I might more categorize that as pink. And then every time it was a hit, that would just be reinforced in your head. Like, there's so many ways that our psychology, which is built on this kind of neural framework, can really screw us. There are ways in which it can really benefit us too. I mean, it's these shortcuts are hugely important just for navigating the everyday world. That said, it's very easy to get caught up in these biases.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, and the military's pouring all this money into how to sort of hone this to make people better at detecting danger. And it could have implications. Whatever they learn could have implications for all of us.
Yeah, we just have to be super careful not to dip into the sort of pseudoscience side of it, because there's always 2 sides of the same coin, right? There's the legitimate research that we can be doing to learn how to improve these aspects of our kind of mental functioning. And then there is the sort of the dark underbelly of that. Which we can really easily dive into when we want these results to be, kind of better than they are, or when we want to be able to explain away something that is much more complicated than it seems on the surface level at a very surface level. And that's why I appreciate your book, because you don't avoid the pill. It's not just all peanut butter, what I mean?
Right, yeah.
And because sometimes we can make the mistake by oversimplifying or using too many analogies, and that's so necessary in science communication, and I don't bemoan it by any stretch, but a lot of times with these cutting edge technologies, I think the easy route is to speculate heavily about the future and to sort of give everything the same amount of clout and not use any skepticism going into it. But I think that you do a good job of balancing, this is what's happening now, this is what could happen from it, but also some of these things probably or maybe it won't happen, or let's redirect and course correct to something that's reasonable, because that's also important.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I actually, when I thought about doing this book, I mean, there's tons of books about human augmentation and sort of these kinds of technologies. But what I found was just a lot of them really they were futuristic. They weren't based on what's happening now. They were like, we will be able to do this. We will be able to do that. And they're also, I found that either they did that, which is good, but who can compete with Ray Kurzweil? You know what I mean? And and I actually, and when I read some of Ray Kurzweil's stuff, sometimes it blows my mind, but it also sometimes I'm like, well, wait, is this possible or not? Because I can't.
Yeah, it's like, is this a shaky foundation, or is this actually based on like real kind of algorithmic evidence? Right.
So I wanted to go out, since I'm a reporter, and then also the other genre I found, or the other approach is just looking at it from just getting into these vague ivory tower debates over ethics, where you're not really specifying what you're talking about. Like, it's hard for me to evaluate whether I should be concerned about the ethics of something if it's not happening, or if it's so vague, it's not specific. So when I wrote the book, since I'm a reporter, I wanted to go out and find out what's happening now and how is it affecting people. And I tried to bring up the ethical issues and also suggest some of the places this might go. But I just wanted to know, well, how does this really work? And if this is possible, how would that work? And so I sort of thought of it almost like kind of like a owner's manual for the human body and mind as we move into the future.
Absolutely, because it's unavoidable. I mean, in some ways, if you took a big step back and you looked at not just the last year, the last 5 years, but sort of the trajectory that we've been on with biomedical technology for decades and even centuries, we already are engineering human beings to a large extent. We take synthetic drugs. We have, all of these different prostheses within the body. People rebuild their hips and they rebuild, and a lot of it is more mechanical and maybe in the kind of osteo field, but we are moving more and more there in the kind of neuro place. I take antidepressants every day. Like, I am bioengineered in that way. because, they really do help with a fundamental issue. So we are already on this trajectory. It's really just, I think, about reframing and rethinking what that trajectory means as the technology improves. And I like taking that perspective because sometimes it kind of takes the fun out of it, but it also makes it much more plausible, much more reasonable, and it takes the fear out of it. A lot of times what's new and scary to someone who's kind of being a Luddite is just because they haven't shifted their perspective and looked back and said, oh, all this other new stuff has already happened. This is just a new kind of new that I now have to adapt to.
Right. The resolution is just getting better. And like antidepressants, we don't really know how they work. Right.
Yep.
So, but
and there's no test for it. I couldn't go in and get, a spinal tap, which I wouldn't want to anyway. And the doctor look at all my serotonin and dopamine and say, okay, we need to do this drug at this dose and blah, blah, blah. Like it's all guesswork right now.
But when people are scared, what I say is, we already have the technology to vaporize each other with the push of a button, with nuclear bombs. Like, how much worse? I don't know. We're already screwed.
That's true. And all of this stuff is not like, we're not talking about bioengineering for warfare. We're talking about bioengineering for improvement. And I think a lot of times people are afraid of the idea of enhancement, of, everything's fine now. Why would I want to make it quote unquote better? And then we don't have a level playing field. And then, there's all these ethical debates that come out of it. But I think sometimes approaching the problem that way or framing the problem that way is a little bit irresponsible, simply because most all of these technologies that are actually happening in the research laboratory right now have to do with solving real problems.
Right, exactly. I did actually try and delve into the ethics and point them out, where there might be problems. But as one military scientist I talked to said, is a baseball bat, I said, what do you think? He said, is a baseball bat a good thing or a bad thing? It depends on how you use it. If you're using it to beat somebody over the head with, it's a bad thing. But if you're using it to play baseball with, it's a good thing. So I tried to point out where some of these things were, and I went in, wondering what I would think. But I really did find that, at least right now, the most exciting and interesting things, and what's really driving this revolution is, unlocking untapped human resilience, giving people back things that they lost, like Hugh Herr being able to jog around Walton Pond every day. People come in, they haven't been able to walk, they've lost limbs, they try on his prosthetics and they start to cry because it feels like the real thing. Pat Fletcher looking at a mountain, and the, that Parkinson's thing. One of the other incredible things I did, that blew my mind was I watched brain surgery for not the deep brain stimulation that they do for Parkinson's, but somebody who does that, but who's trying to develop the next generation of it. Mm-hmm. And I followed that guy around for a day, and that kind of blew my mind. It blew my mind even more, not him just threading in those things and, the wires for the deep brain stimulation, but I actually watched him go into somebody's deep brain to cut out something that was causing seizures. And it was
it's still crazy that is just a normal everyday procedure.
Right. Yeah.
That these people do this multiple times in a day.
Yeah.
And the outcomes are incredibly good. Obviously, if you ever have to have brain surgery, which I never have, never even had surgery, but if I ever had to have brain surgery, it would feel like the biggest decision of my life. It would be the most stressful experience. But for these physicians and these surgeons who do it on a regular basis, for them, it's an odds game, not an odds game, but a numbers game. They can look through and say, oh, no, this is really safe. You'll be fine.
Yeah.
You're going to feel 1,000% better after this.
Just the spatial resolution that they had to map where they put electrodes, they could, it was they could pull up these incredibly detailed scans on the screen and just maneuver things directly to the part of the brain they wanted. With a precision that wasn't possible a little while ago. But yeah, it blew my mind. I didn't know that people's brains beat in time with their hearts.
Yeah, we were just talking about that on my other podcast on the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe just last week. We were talking about what a brain looks like when the skull is first taken off. And it's like, no, it pulsates.
Yeah, that was crazy.
And some of the guys on the podcast were like, what? Oh my God. Like, it's like, I'm rethinking what a brain looks like. Because we're so used to seeing brains. When we see brains, we're either seeing artist representations or we're seeing dead brains. It's very rare that we see a living brain inside of a skull.
Yeah.
Because there's so many blood. Think about all the blood in your body and how much of it is in your brain at any given time. Like,
and when I followed this guy around at Mass General for the brain surgery, I've been working on the book for a while. So, and I had all these pictures of the brain up, and like, I lived in New York for a while, and like people have celebrity sightings. My sister saw Mini-Me at the Merc Bar once, and this was like the best celebrity sighting. I was like, oh my God, there's the amygdala, there's the hippocampus.
That's hilarious.
I was afraid I would throw up when I went into the surgery, but instead it was, really interesting. I was going to say, just that's because you practiced. Right.
In a lot of ways, it's because you looked at all these scans so much and you really practiced. So you were able to actually appreciate the awe and not just be, ooh, of some of the, the bone saw sound.
Right. Well, but I was going to say this particular surgery was interesting because when we're talking about antidepressants, they've been funded again by the military, but it's through DARPA's brain initiative. They were funneling it. I'm sorry, Obama's brain initiative. They were funneling the money through DARPA, which is the Pentagon Blue Sky thing. And this was partially because of all the traumatic brain injuries and stuff. But they're trying to develop a new generation of deep brain stimulation where you can thread these electrodes into people's brains that not only will stimulate parts of the brain that are causing tremors and Parkinson's, but will also monitor populations of neurons to see, what kind of brain activity is associated with different abnormalities. So what they're working with this lab called Draper Labs, which helped design in the last century the guidance systems to go to the moon, and now they're working in this frontier, which is the human body and mind. And they were designing this device, which is a new generation of deep brain stimulation, which has many, many more tentacles to it in the brain, so it can monitor a much larger population of neurons, and then the computer program analyzes the firing patterns of these that these electrodes are picking up, and it correlates them with different brain states. So, for instance, if you have a soldier, a veteran who is having a PTSD attack, right, or an anxiety attack, it would pick up, how different circuits of the brain are responding right before a panic attack, and the algorithm would know what is normal and what isn't, and it would theoretically, shock the system back into a normal state. Now, there's all sorts of
a super high fidelity seizure dog.
Right. Yeah. And there's all sorts of scary mind control, ethical considerations and fears, but it's also, when we talk about depression, like they've actually used this, the current generation of DBS that they use to stop Parkinson's tremors, to stop OCD, people who can't even leave their hotel room because they were washing their hands for so long, even when they're supposed to get surgery. And it turns out, it's like a record. It's just a different neural circuit, a different loop where it is getting stuck, like a record getting stuck. And so instead of your hand getting the signal to shake over and over again, it's like your brain is sending the same thought over and over again. They've discovered, that there are these neural loops that loop through these circuits that loop through several different areas of the brain. And so they're trying to identify that, and they're trying to, treat things like, well, their mandate is to try and treat not just anxiety attacks and TBI, but also depression. And so, when you take an antidepressant, you're flooding the whole brain with serotonin, and it's very imprecise, because it's only a small part of so it's not really that robust. But if you know exactly what part of the brain is messed up, and that's causing the depression, then instead of flooding the whole brain with these chemicals, you can just apply a robust electrical signal directly to that area, to tweak the neurons. Of course.
Yeah, it's the same improvement we're seeing in cancer biology. Used to be, it would just be like annihilate the person with chemo and radiation, and they would get so sick from it. And sometimes we still have to do that.
Right.
But for most cancers now, we know that there are molecular markers and we can target very specific cells and we can save a lot of the other cells from that kind of destruction. Not that, flooding your brain with, excuse me, with serotonin is destructive, but, it's obviously not as specific as we'd like, which means that you may not have as good of outcomes. I can also see why this is important for Parkinson's patients, because the sad truth of these amazing and incredible deep brain stimulation surgeries is that they only work for so long, because Parkinson's is degenerative. And eventually it's just not going to work anymore. Sometimes you have to move them, sometimes you have to up the voltage, but eventually they don't work. And so being able to look at that feedback and see where they're, less responsive or where we're seeing more damage to the cells would be invaluable, instead of having to open the patient's brain up over and over or subject them to multiple scans.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting stuff.
Absolutely. So, but I got to ask you then, obviously most of what we're talking about here and most of what you talked about in your book is bioengineering to improve outcomes for individuals with dysfunction or damage. But obviously the other side of that coin is performance enhancement, improving psychiatric states, all of those kinds of things. So, and maybe I just don't know it, but you have an issue that you would love to correct. But if you were able to pick one of these things now off the shelf and say, I want that, is there anything that you've thought about? A superpower you'd like to have through bioengineering?
I don't know. So many. I mean, well, now I'm now I have kids and stuff, right? So, and I live in the burbs, and I'm a journalist. So, I'm not as eager to be dunking like Michael Jordan or something. So that eliminates the physical. Although I could have taken steroids, I guess, in high school if I wanted to, but I had
are already
no some, desire. But the one that
negative side effects from that, though, for sure.
yeah. The one that kind of seems appealing is I did a chapter on memory, trying to decode the molecular underpinnings of memory, and there's, and that's an interesting story, just in that there's a guy, he was at Cold Springs, which is in Long Island. He was working on the molecular basis of memory under Watson, of Watson and Crick, right? Mm-hmm, and he actually managed to produce fruit flies with photographic memories. And then he was approached by this billionaire styrofoam magnate named Ken Dart, who's if you ever had a styrofoam cup that says Dart on it, this guy's like an heir to that fortune, and he is bankrolling this guy Tim Tully outside in a lab outside of San Diego to try and decode the molecular basis of memory and make what some people have dubbed Viagra for the brain, which would just be that's partially because Viagra is this blockbuster drug, because we have this aging population, but this would apply, instead of sexual dysfunction, it would apply to memory, and you would take a pill and it would be a memerization pill. So I thought,
my God, I want it. I
thought, hey, that would be cool. And I talked to, I visited this place, but I also, they've launched a worldwide hunt for people with superior memory. And they're hoping to collect a large enough sample that they can then take their DNA and try and find more drug targets. But they're trying to put 2 drug targets in the pipeline every year. And I think they already have some in early stage trials. But over the course of reporting this, I met this 11-year-old boy. I talked to him on the phone, who seems to have a superior memory. And this kid, well, first of all, he could tell me what he was doing on my birthday every day for the last 4 years. And then he could tell me who had my birthday. My birthday's August 1st. He told me that Francis Scott Key, the guy who wrote the Star Spangled Banner, had my birthday in the 19th century. So I was like, wow, that was just off the top of his head. But his mother realized there was something different about him when they would go through they would be walking through their neighborhood, and he would point at cars and say these random numbers. And eventually she realized, he was like 3 or something, that he had memorized the numbers on the inspection stickers of these cars.
Oh my God.
So I don't know. So yeah,
that's special. I would be in that other group that they were testing.
Right.
They would have the group of the superior memory, and then the group of like we need to keep them for later so we can
Right.
improve that. That's actually a huge deficit that I struggle with, especially autobiographical memory. I have a huge problem remembering dates, remembering things that happened in my life and when they happened. I'm basically the opposite of one of those people who can say what they were wearing on Tuesday, August, whatever,
Right.
Yeah. It's just, it blows my mind to hear. But then again, we do hear the stories about individuals with superior memories really having deficits in other areas because they have to put so much sort of architecture into their memory capabilities.
That's true. But, this guy, I just found what the pill would supposedly be temporary, right? Yeah. So you could take it before a cocktail party and I don't know what deficit you would have. Maybe you wouldn't be as witty in the party, but you would remember everybody's name the next day when you call them. But
maybe take it while you're studying for an exam. That would probably be a good use. Yeah.
And it was just very interesting learning about how memory works down to the molecular level, which they actually are to some extent beginning to understand.
Yeah. We've had a long and pretty robust understanding at a sort of structural level. I think we've historically had a very good that was the first way, the first parsing of the brain that we got pretty good at, is where are things localized and what happens if you knock out those parts of the brain. But of course, then we had to start understanding what's happening both at the molecular level, what's happening inside of the cell, and almost more complicated, what's happening at the level of the interplay between cells.
Yeah. The question is, well, for one guy, one of the pioneers is named James McGaugh, and he was wondering why do I remember why does everyone remember where they are when JFK was shot or when the Twin Towers came down? You know what I mean? What is it about memories. That? Yeah, flashbulb memories. And for this guy, Tim Tully, what got him interested in is he was sort of a maniac. He played this maniacal game with his friends when they were growing up. They would race their bikes towards each other at full speed and see. It was basically a game of chicken. And then in the winter, they would get on sleds and they would try and knock each other off this cliff. So one day he got knocked off the cliff, and instead of bailing out, he was 12. It was Christmas. They'd opened their presents, and so all the neighborhood kids gathered for this, Lord of the Flies violent Spartacus
I would assume
game.
most of these neighborhood kids were boys. I'm just going to make that assumption.
I think so, yeah. But I'm not sure. I didn't. But he got knocked off the hill. This cliff, it was like a miniature cliff. They called it a cliff. And normally you're supposed to bail out and then get your sled and then climb up. But he just decided he would try and ride it out. And he hit a buried tree stump, went flying through the air and knocked himself in the face with his knee so hard that he knocked out one of his front teeth, which he found in the spring later when and he woke up. He knocked himself unconscious. He woke up in bed. And he couldn't remember the last 2 weeks of his life. And he thought it was the same day as 2 weeks before. So much so that he didn't believe that it was Christmas and his parents rewrapped his presents so he could experience opening them again. And so he had always wondered, what happened to that memory? How is that possible? And what they've discovered is there's something called consolidation, which is we have a short-term memory and it's going to disappear. But for some memories, there's this molecular level process that occurs that consolidates the memory into something that is, stored by those structures that you mentioned, the hippocampus, and when it's consolidated, then it becomes a long-term memory. But you can do things that interrupt consolidation, like knock yourself in the head, get a head trauma, or so electric shock.
He never lost the memory. He just never actually formed it to begin with.
Right. Yeah. He never consolidated it, and it never went from short term to long term. And so what he's studying is, and some of the earliest experiments found, this guy, James McGaugh, he found that you could take a mouse and you put him through a maze and you give him strychnine right afterwards, and it actually augments consolidation. which was totally counterintuitive because people were like, well, he's already had the experience. You can't augment a memory if you give somebody a drug after. But it turns out, and then he sort of followed that thread. There's a different guy than Tim Tully, a generation before. He followed that thread and found out that what it is what you're hacking into is the emotional systems of the brain. When you have an experience that is emotionally freighted, it unleashes this molecular level cascade, which enhances consolidation, which makes sense because you can imagine if you're a really hungry caveman wandering around and then you find an apple tree and you haven't eaten in 3 days and you're just overjoyed, then you feel all this emotion, and then serves an evolutionary point to be able to remember something important. So,
and of course, then that translates to knowing where you were on 9/11 or when JFK was shot.
Right. Yeah, because your body's flooded with these hormones. So these hormones that enhance consolidation. So what Tim Tully did is he's gone, in this generation with these fruit flies, and now he's trying to dig even deeper. So you don't even need the emotion. You just dig into the end of the chain of the whatever molecular level cascade it is, and you mess with these molecules called Krebs. And you either there's things that are called Krebs enhancers and things that are called Krebs repressors, and you enhance you enhance the molecular level signals that build for permanent connections.
And this is a super basic cycle within cells.
Yeah. Right.
It's like, we're not talking like something that's happening outside of the cell or something that's happening in between cell to cell communication. These are basic molecular cascades that are happening like in the nucleus of the cells of every cell in your body. But specifically interesting that if you disrupt them or you improve them within these neurons, that it has a profound effect on actual behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, Adam, this has been such a fun chat. I don't want to keep you much longer because we've been talking for over an hour and it's the weekend. Okay. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask you the closing 2 questions that I ask everybody when I have them on my show. Whenever I forget to ask, I really hear about it in social media. So are you ready for those final 2 questions? They're kind of big picture.
Sure.
All right. So the first one is, when you think about the future, in whatever context is important to you, it could be, the future of the human body, as we've been discussing. It could be the future of humanity, or even the future of the universe as a whole, or maybe just the future of your life and your family. First, what is the thing, if you had to pick one, that sort of keeps you up the most at night, that makes you the most concerned, the most nervous, the most kind of pessimistic and bummed out about the future? But then on the flip side of that, so we're not crying when we say goodbye, what is the thing that you are most hopeful and optimistic and excited for?
Oh.
I know, I'm a jerk.
I gotta pause. I was going to say for the first one, Donald Trump, but
that's a pretty good answer.
He'll be gone. I don't know. The climate thing really bums me out, I got to say, but it's like, but it's always there. So
it's also the most popular answer,
right?
Of course.
I don't really know what to say about that. I love nature. I love natural beauty. I love being outside. It bums me out that we're ruining the planet and that's going to ruin things for my kids. At the same time, I do have faith in science, so maybe we'll be able to come up with some sort of engineering thing that reverses climate damage. So, I don't know if it keeps me up at night because I sort of just shut down so I don't have to think about it. Because it's
I think
so
we
depressing.
Mostly do that.
My head's in the sand with some of the things going on, but so that's alarming to me. Trying to think what else. There are some ethical issues here. A lot of the technologies that I talk about do have potential ethical downsides. I'll just say, in this realm, when I went to the Beijing Genomics Institute, they're trying to reverse engineer intelligence. And so I asked one of the guys on that project, I said, well, what do you think about that? People are concerned it'll lead to an arms race. And he said, well, I think it'll be available to everyone and a parent should be able to decide how intelligent they want their children to be. And then I said, well, isn't there anything about genetic engineering that alarms you? And he said, well, I can imagine a really aggressive tiger mom who decides she wants to engineer her kid with brilliant intelligence, but also with sociopathic tendencies that give them a lack of altruism so they can get ahead. That would be scary.
And you're like, yeah, that's pretty scary.
Right. So, I don't know. I guess the North Koreans could, something could
God.
happen there. Or,
all you had to say was the North Koreans.
Right.
Jeez.
But, I try and live Zen. I mean, I want my kids to be safe, but I try not to.
It's a triage thing, right? We can't obsess over everything. And ultimately, when we look out the window, it is beautiful. And there is a lot of thriving life, and human beings smile and wave and hug one another. And, all these terrible things are happening at the same time. But we've also been pretty damn good at I think, keeping things at bay, which gives me hope for the future. Is there anything that you're really optimistic about when you think kind of down the line, like what the future could hold that really excites you?
Well, my book is about human resilience. So I've just been impressed by the power and resilience of human beings. And I don't, I said this in my book and just in my own journeys, I've decided over, that one of the things that encapsulates what I think most about human happiness and life satisfaction is pieces of evidence was the Harvard Grant study, which is one of the longest longitudinal studies of human beings. And they studied people from JFK's generation, like JFK and Ben Bradley. And they found that people life satisfaction is determined a lot by our relationships, meaningful work, but also our relationships. And I just don't think that that's going to change. You know what I mean? And if anything, I think that people have said that we're alienated because of technology, but things like Facebook are, people are finding they help us connect with people that we otherwise wouldn't be able to, like people we grew up with and have moved. So I don't think that's going to change. And in terms of what I'm optimistic about, beyond that, trying to think, I don't know. I mean, I have faith in humanity, but yeah, I don't know. Human resilience. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe it's safe to say
we're more. I'll send you an email.
We're cautiously. No, that's fair. That's fair. Maybe it's safe to say we're cautiously optimistic.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that the stories of resilience are some of the most emotional and kind of, I don't know a good way to put it, but they're stories that we cling to most readily. They speak to us at a really kind of fundamental level because we all have to experience bouncing back, and we can all put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who's had a profound loss, even if we haven't, because we've had a version of that somewhere along the way. And ultimately, life is fleeting, and we will all lose people we love. We will lose aspects of ourselves that we love, and ultimately, we ourselves will be lost to time. And so I think there's something truly fundamental about that theme that maybe you would have to be genetically engineered by your tiger mom to have extreme prowess and no empathy in order to not respond positively to stories of resilience. And I appreciate that you have put them in such a wonderful book that's a great example of science writing as well. I'm glad that we were finally able to get together to talk about it. Guys, you should go to your bookstore now. It's available. It is available, right?
Yeah. Amazon, bookstore.
Wherever you buy
Audible.
books, and I'll link to it in the podcast, The Bodybuilders, Inside the Science of the Engineered Human. Well, Adam, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you in social media to say hi, to say they like the book, and to follow your work?
Sure. Yeah. I have my own website, adampiore.com. I also have a Twitter handle, Adam Piore. And I think I set up a Facebook page too, the Engineered Human.
Awesome. And I'll link to those. It
might be Engineered
as well.
Humans. I'm not sure.
We'll find it. Easy to find. Right. Well, Adam, thank you for joining me today. It was such a wonderful chat.
Okay. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.